The eviction notice flapped in the wind, pinned right where Maggie's hand used to rest every noon. 69 Waitress Dockside Diner still pours coffee straighter than the kid with 2 good knees, smelled like burnt sanka and cold sea air that morning, and her old logistics patch slipped from her coat pocket as the judge cleared his throat. Ever seen a courtroom forget to breathe? At 5:31 a.m., the first hiss of the coffee pot cut through the silence of Dockside Diner. Maggie LeClaire wiped the same counter she had for 23 years, with the same rhythm, the same quiet. Outside, the wind rolled in low from the bay, brushing dried leaves across the windows like forgotten pages. Inside, the red-cushioned stools stood in their usual places, one still creaking slightly from that time in '98 when the floorboard shifted. Maggie didn't rush. She never did. Her hand, steady as ever, reached for the switch to turn on the neon sign, its glow faint in the morning dark. Dockside Diner. Since 1964. Everyone in town knew her as Miss Maggie with the steady hand. No one asked where that hand had learned steadiness. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe they figured it was just from years of pouring sanka and wiping down counters. She moved behind the register and opened the cash drawer, counting by touch more than sight. The radio played softly from under the pastry case, Johnny Cash low and scratchy like it always was on Mondays. She poured herself a mug from the red thermos she'd brought from home and sat it near the back burner to keep warm. Sanka. Black. The only way she took it. By 6:05 a.m., the regulars shuffled in. Hank, the retired fireman, gave her a small nod and dropped into his usual booth by the window. Linda, the mail carrier, sat at the counter and unwrapped a banana from her bag without saying a word. Trucker Dave parked his rig where he always did, back-end crooked like it had arthritis, and walked in whistling a low tune that didn't match the radio. Maggie moved slowly but precisely, her limp more noticeable in the cold. She refilled cups without asking, placed the cinnamon rolls 2 at a time in the warmer. The tip jar clinked softly as Hank slipped in $2 bills. "Thanks, darlin'," he muttered, barely looking up. From the back kitchen, a voice called out too loudly, "Hey, Miss Maggie." "Think you could walk that warmer over here any slower, Kyle?" 17 local high school senior seasonal help until basketball season started up again. He stood holding a tray mimicking her shuffle with exaggerated steps behind the stainless counter. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She simply picked up a clean rag and returned to wiping the front glass of the pastry case. The cloth moved in steady, familiar circles. Linda glanced at Kyle and gave a quiet shake of the head. Kyle smirked, tossed a packet of sugar into a bin, and muttered something under his breath that got lost in the hiss of the griddle. Just after 9:00 a.m., a woman in a camel coat pushed through the front door. Her badge read Rockwell Chamber of Commerce, and she carried a stack of glossy flyers. "Good morning," she sang, too bright for the mood of the diner. "Just a little update on the holiday redevelopment project. You'll start to see some new signage going up this week." Maggie accepted the flyer without a word. She folded it once, then again, and slipped it beneath the napkin holder. By noon, the diner had thinned. The regulars drifted out like tidewater, leaving behind half-folded newspapers and crumbs. Kyle clocked out without a goodbye, tossing his apron in a heap on the prep table. Maggie wiped down the booths and refilled the salt shakers, her movements slowing only when her hip began to ache. She stepped out into the November breeze, pulling her coat close. The walk home was only 3 blocks, but it always felt longer on Mondays. The air smelled of wet wood and salt, and somewhere far off, a gull cried like it had something to say, but no one to say it to. Her house sat at the end of Chestnut Lane, small, weather-beaten, but kept with care. The porch railing leaned slightly westward, the paint chipped from seasons gone by. As she stepped onto the first board, her eyes caught the stark white paper taped to the door frame. Notice to vacate. Scheduled demolition, December 10th. Rockwell Coastal Redevelopment Initiative. She didn't blink. Instead, she lowered herself slowly onto the top step, her hands on her knees. The coffee in her thermos had gone cold, but she drank it anyway, eyes scanning the horizon that had once held fishing boats and dock hands, now cranes and steel skeletons of condos. Her fingers trembled as they set the cup down beside her, not from fear, not from cold, but from memory. Inside a shoebox, tucked behind a heater, contains an old photograph, a patch sewn with thread long faded and a folded logistics map with blood along its edge. The paper crackled louder than expected when Maggie peeled it from her doorframe. Something final echoed in the silence. She held it up to the soft light leaking through the lace curtains of her upstairs window, the black print crisp against the cream stock. "Notice to vacate," it read. Her thumb traced the official seal near the bottom, and she caught the faint scent of ink, too clean, too precise. She didn't frown. She didn't curse. She folded the page once, then again, and laid it on the counter beside her rotary phone. The heater clanked to life like it always did, groaning through the floorboards and puffing out lukewarm air that barely reached her ankles. She made a cup of Sanka Black and sat in the armchair by the window. The one cushion gave slightly beneath her as she watched a single leaf tumble from the last stubborn branch outside. Rockwell's trees had nearly shed their colors now. The cold was coming in. She reached for the notebook on the end table. The cover of faded green canvas with fraying edges creaked open. Inventory. Cold weather. Kits the front page read in block letters. Beneath it, a list of items written in neat columns. Socks, mylar blankets, MREs. She stared at it a moment, then turned the page to a blank one and wrote simply, Wednesday, court. At 6:04 a.m., she locked the apartment and walked the 4 blocks to Dockside Diner. She didn't limp more than usual. Inside, the scent of cinnamon was faint. Someone had forgotten to start the warmers. Kyle was leaning against the prep station, swiping through his phone. He didn't look up until she moved past him toward the sink. "You good, Miss Maggie?" he asked, scratching the back of his neck. She hung her coat, then turned the faucet just enough to hear the hiss of hot water. "Still pouring," she said simply. Kyle stared after her, then glanced down at the paper towel in his hand like it was suddenly too clean to use. The regulars came and went same as always. Hank tipped his usual $2 without a word. Linda dropped a copy of the classifieds on the counter. Dave left a scratcher ticket with his receipt. Maggie served each one without fuss. That afternoon, after the lunch rush died down, Maggie unwrapped a loaf of banana bread and placed it carefully in a brown paper bag. She didn't say where she was going. She simply nodded once at Kyle and stepped out into the chill. The firehouse door creaked open, and Hank stood framed in the hallway. He didn't ask why she was there, just took the bag and muttered, "Still warm, fresh from the back," she replied. He nodded once. Their eyes met briefly. That was enough. Back at the diner, Kyle was wiping down the syrup bottles when a man in a tailored gray suit stepped through the front door. He carried a leather portfolio and moved with the confidence of someone used to not being questioned. His shoes didn't squeak on the tile. They clicked. "I'm looking for a Miss LeClaire," he said, scanning the nearly empty diner. Maggie emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't blink. "You found her." He extended the portfolio. "This is to inform you that you are summoned to appear in Rockwell Municipal Court next Wednesday, 9:00 a.m. The redevelopment order has been fast-tracked. We're hoping to move on acquisition before Thanksgiving." "Quick season," Maggie said, folding the paper. He hesitated. "Excuse me. Leaves fall fast this year," she murmured, tucking the document into her coat. Then she turned away. Kyle watched Maggie fold the paper, tuck it in her coat, and return to wiping the same counter she always had. The courthouse steps looked taller than Maggie remembered. Or maybe her knees just felt older. She paused at the bottom step, one gloved hand gripping the polished head of her cane. The morning wind snuck under her collar colder than usual for November. A passing woman glanced her way, offered a hesitant smile, then kept walking. Maggie didn't smile back. Not out of rudeness, but because her breath was focused on balance. One foot, then another. The cane clicked lightly against the granite as she climbed. A younger version of herself might have marched up these steps without hesitation. Back then, with orders in hand and a convoy waiting, her knees didn't complain. Now even the courthouse felt like hostile ground. Her coat hung heavier across her shoulders today, a gray wool relic with the lining thinned from decades. It had no insignia, no medals, just the lingering scent of cedar and wind. A janitor sweeping near the doorway gave her a small nod. She returned it wordlessly, then stepped inside. The warmth hit her first, then the hush. Wooden benches lined both sides of the main hall, waxed to a dull shine. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead like nervous ticks. A clerk directed her down a side corridor to courtroom B. Kyle was already there. He sat near the back shoulders, hunched, his parka still zipped up. His hands fidgeted with a paper coffee cup, now half collapsed. When she entered, he looked up abruptly, then down again, guilt rippling across his face like he'd been caught reading someone's diary. Maggie gave no reaction. She simply made her way to the first row of public seating and sat slowly, purposefully. She folded her coat across her lap. Her cane lay to one side, parallel to her calf. She rested her hands atop the coat, still steady. Judge Spencer entered promptly at 9, a thin man with a bristly mustache and the kind of posture that made you sit straighter just by looking at him. The court clerk called the session to order, and the first words out of Mr. Redford's attorney set the tone. Our client has nothing but respect for Miss LeClaire's history in Rockwell. However, progress requires difficult decisions. The attorney, young Trim, and perhaps too proud of his tie, began painting Maggie as an unwilling holdout. The last commercial rezoning in the area occurred in 1993, he said, pacing slowly. Since then, property values have stagnated. Miss LeClaire's diner, while once a beloved institution, now occupies space earmarked for essential community revitalization. The word revitalization echoed sharply in the room. Whispers floated from the gallery. She's the pie lady, right? Didn't she used to march in the parade? She should be in assisted living. Maggie didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, her gaze neither combative nor resigned, just present, a quiet presence amid carefully rehearsed noise. Kyle shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable. His fingers pinched the edge of his coat. At one point he leaned forward as if he might say something, but didn't. When it was Maggie's turn to respond, Judge Spencer asked gently, Miss LeClaire, would you care to make a statement or offer any objections? She met his gaze, nodded once, and said, No, sir. No theatrics, no plea. Just the even tone of someone who'd already seen too many courtrooms where words changed nothing. Outside, the wind rose, howling faintly through narrow windows. A radio played faintly from the lobby, something about a cold front moving down from Canada snow expected by Tuesday. Inside, Redford began outlining his vision. Mixed-use retail below, condos above. Small-town charm preserved in modern form. All ready by Christmas pending legal clearance. That's when the courtroom doors opened. 3 men entered. Not hurried, not loud. They wore dress blues jackets, buttoned crisp ribbons neat. One was silver-haired with a jaw like an old movie star. Another looked barely 40. But it was the third, the tallest, whose boots tapped a measured rhythm on the linoleum. They scanned the room as if on patrol. Kyle turned. His mouth fell slightly open. The tallest one whispered, Holy hell, that's her. Maggie doesn't turn around. The room didn't fall silent, it held its breath. 3 seals stood still, eyes fixed not on the judge but on a woman in a gray sweater by the aisle. There was a long beat before anyone moved. The air felt denser somehow, as if every particle had turned to glass. Kyle's heart pounded so loudly in his ears he barely heard the man speak. The oldest of the three stepped forward. His uniform was immaculate creases, sharp ribbons neat, but it was the calm in his eyes that cut through the tension. "Permission to speak. Your Honor." Judge Spencer, uncharacteristically rattled, blinked and nodded. "Granted." The man removed his cover, tucking it under one arm. "Name's Chief Petty Officer Howard Rowley, retired." He glanced at the two men behind him, both still rigid at attention. One looked barely older than Kyle, but there was something in his posture, something that spoke of deserts and danger. The other had tears barely held back in his eyes. Rowley turned back to the judge. "In 2006, we were stationed in Helmand Province. Delta forward. Ops. Our convoy was ambushed. Command was down. Satcoms were scrambled, and we had 6 wounded, no food, no water, and 4 days to any form of extraction." He paused, eyes sweeping across the room, then landing on Maggie. "Then on the 4th day, we heard a woman's voice over the secondary channel. Calm. Direct. No emotion, no fear. She rerouted 5 supply shipments through a corridor that shouldn't have been open. Fuel rations and medicals arrived like clockwork." He inhaled. "She saved our unit. Every single man made it out." Gasps from the gallery trickled in like falling pebbles. Maggie didn't shift in her seat. She simply raised her chin slightly as if bracing for wind. Kyle stared wide-eyed. It didn't compute the same woman who organized sugar packets and mumbled thank yous now stared down 3 seals as if she'd already read the next page of their script. "I was just doing my job," Maggie said softly. "No theater, no denial." The younger SEAL, Lieutenant Darnell, someone murmured, took off his own cover next. His voice trembled when he spoke. "Ma'am, I was one of the 6 wounded. I was 24. I remember thinking I wouldn't see Christmas. Then your voice came through. Told us where to dig. Told us how long we had." Petty Officer Quinn, eyes still glistening, added, "You told us the extraction choppers would be 10 minutes late. You were off by 11 seconds. The courtroom had transformed. Where moments ago there had been skepticism and smirks, now there was awe and something gentler. Maggie hadn't moved. Her coat still lay across her lap, the fold perfectly even. Kyle's mind raced. He recalled teasing her limp just a few weeks ago. The red thermos, the calm, the way she always knew who needed decaf before they asked. And now, this Rowley turned back to the judge. "We didn't know her name. They called her Echo Delta Sierra on our channel. But when I walked in and saw her just sitting there, I knew. You don't forget the voice that saves your life." Judge Spencer looked from the men to Maggie. For a moment he didn't speak. Then gently he set down his gavel and nodded. Rowley straightened. "With your permission." He raised his hand slowly, precisely, and saluted. Lieutenant Darnell and Petty Officer Quinn followed sharp and reverent. No one moved at first, then a quiet shuffle as a woman in the gallery stood, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire courtroom was on its feet. Even Hank, leaning on his cane near the back, lifted 2 fingers to his brow in a slow salute. Kyle swallowed hard and stood as well. Maggie looked straight ahead. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, as if she could still hear the static of a far-off radio. From the hallway, faint strains of bridge over troubled water hummed through the vents. Redford looks around, realizes he's lost the room. "She still broke code," he mutters. No one responds. No ceremony had been planned, but that didn't stop folks from gathering anyway. The first snow of the season hadn't been more than a whisper, just enough to blur the corners of the diner's windows and give Rockwell the look of a faded postcard. Inside Dockside Diner, the scent of cinnamon rolls and maple bacon mingled with brewing Sanka. Maggie moved through it all with the same rhythm as always, Coffee poured at a steady tilt toast flipped without a glance, orders remembered without the need for notes. Kyle had shown up earlier than usual anyway. He'd placed a hand-lettered sign by the register written in neat, hopeful script. Ask her about 2006. It stayed up less than an hour. Maggie spotted it while restocking creamer. She didn't scold, just walked over, eyes soft, and peeled the note from the tape as if it were a petal. She folded it twice, then slid it into the front pocket of her apron. By mid-morning, the diner was fuller than usual for a Tuesday. Hank came in and took his usual seat by the window, nodding once in Maggie's direction. Linda, the mail carrier, brought in a second thermos, this one wrapped in a red and white scarf. "For when yours wears out," she said, trying to sound casual. Dave the trucker left a $5 tip for a coffee he hadn't finished. Near the back, at a two-top usually reserved for tourists in summer, 3 men in navy coats sat quietly. Their presence drew glances, but no one asked questions. The town wasn't sure what to do with reverence, but it was learning. Mrs. Lasky, the town librarian, arrived just before noon. She didn't order anything. Instead, she held out a small embroidered patch, a sun rising behind an open book. "For the wall," she said, as if the gesture had always existed. Maggie hesitated only a second before taking it, her fingers brushing the soft stitching. She turned and pinned it beside the fire department emblem Hank had left that morning. By closing the wall behind the counter looked different. There was a mail carrier patch, a small VFW pin, even a laminated badge from the town's first responders parade in 1994. No plaque, though. Maggie had said no. "I'm not a landmark," she'd told Kyle when he brought it up. "I just make a decent short stack." But 2 days later, as the sun crept up in a pink November sky, there it was, hung with quiet care between the coffee pots and the daily specials board, a small bronze plaque that read, "For the one who didn't flinch." Kyle swore it wasn't him. Maggie didn't ask. She looked at it once, really looked, then picked up the red thermos, filled a mug, and brought it to Hank without a word. Customers kept arriving, and Maggie kept pouring. Nothing about the way she moved suggested a shift, and yet the whole room felt altered. Regulars who used to grunt now offered soft greetings. A couple from Boston left a 20 beneath their empty plates. A young woman asked Maggie to autograph a napkin. Kyle watched it all with a strange kind of pride, the kind that stuck in your chest and made it hard to sit still. He hovered behind the counter, helping where he could. Around 2 p.m., when the rush slowed, he noticed Maggie retrieve something from under the counter, a worn logistics map. Edges frayed fold lines like veins. Without explanation, she slipped it into a display frame next to the sugar packets. "That always belonged there," someone murmured. The air in the diner had changed. It wasn't louder, just steadier, like everyone had adjusted their pace to match hers. Tips piled up in the jar even from those who rarely left change. A young man in a college hoodie dropped off a bouquet of tulips. Maggie nodded politely and passed them on to Kyle. "Take them to the VFW hall," she said. "They could use a little color." Later that evening, the last of the customers filtered out. Kyle wiped the counter one last time, mimicking Maggie's figure-8 motion. The radio hummed low in the background, playing Simple Gifts. Outside, snowflakes danced under the street lamp. As Maggie closes for the night, Kyle asks, "Did you ever get scared?" She replies, "Only when no one double-checked the labels." The diner opened at 5:00 a.m. sharp, but Maggie had already been there since 4:15, laying out cranberry muffins and folding napkins by hand. The pre-dawn stillness outside Dockside Diner was deep and blue, the kind of cold that crackled on car windshields and made front doors stick. Inside, warmth blossomed from the kitchen coffee percolated in quiet burbles, the oven hummed low, and the scent of cloves and nutmeg lingered like memory. Maggie moved gently among the clatter of plates and silverware, a cloth tucked in her waistband, her hands steady as she placed folded napkins beside each place setting. Kyle arrived next, his hair damp from a rushed shower shirt half tucked in. Morning, he mumbled, eyes still sleepy. Maggie handed him a tray of pumpkin bread without a word. He didn't ask about the compass clipped to her apron today, it just looked like it belonged. By 6:00 a.m., the town began to trickle in. Hank carrying 2 casseroles, Linda with a basket of dinner rolls, Mrs. Lasky balancing a pecan pie atop a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Someone brought deviled eggs, someone else a green bean dish covered in slivered almonds. Folding tables were pulled from the storage closet in back, pushed together in long rows that stretched the length of the diner. Paper place cards fluttered slightly under the draft from the old heater. Kyle had written each name by hand. On Maggie's, he'd printed 2 words, Phoenix 9. She stared at it for a long moment before turning it face down. The morning unfolded like a scene remembered rather than lived. Elderly couples shared old stories. Children darted between legs with napkins tucked in their collars. Someone strummed a guitar softly in the corner. The smell of roast turkey floated from the kitchen, mingling with cinnamon and maple while steam fogged the windows so thick it was easy to forget the world outside. At one point, a small girl with tightly braided hair stood on a chair and read from a note card. "My grandpa says thank you," she said, gripping the card with both hands. "He said you gave him soup and silence in 2006. I wasn't born yet, but he says that soup mattered." Maggie didn't answer. She just blinked slowly and looked down at her plate. Later, Kyle was nudged toward the center of the room. "Say something," someone whispered. He stood behind the pie counter, throat-dry, cheeks flushed. He rubbed the back of his neck. I used to make fun of Miss Maggie for how she walked. Never once thought to ask where she'd walked." He paused, then added, "I was wrong." Silence held for a beat. Then Maggie raised her chipped mug, steam curling in the golden morning light. "To the ones who didn't ask to be noticed," she said. Glasses clinked. A few tears were wiped away discreetly. Hank handed her a plate piled high, muttering, "You're not eating enough." She took it with a nod. Near the door, a gust of cold air cut through the warmth as it opened. Redford stood there, hesitant, hat in hand. The room quieted, forks hovering midair. He walked to the counter, said nothing, and placed a thick envelope beside the register. "Property rights withdrawn," he said, voice quiet. "Thank you for reminding me who we are." He turned and left before anyone could reply. Maggie didn't touch the envelope. She didn't need to. As the clapping rose, tentative, then swelling, she stepped outside. Snow fell in slow, soft spirals. She took a breath that smelled of sea salt and chimney smoke. A man walked up the sidewalk, hands deep in his coat pockets. Maggie held the door open. He nodded politely as he passed, never recognizing her. The smell of coffee outlasted the applause. Some mornings start with muffins and folded napkins, but end with something far less visible, yet far more lasting. On that Thanksgiving morning, what changed wasn't the diner or the snowfall. It was the way a town saw one of its own. When we choose to look past limp walks and quiet eyes, we often find the strongest among us were never asking to be seen. They were showing us how to live. Like a compass worn quietly on an apron, kindness has a way of pointing us home when we forget the way. So maybe today, hold the door a little longer. And if this story touched something familiar, let it travel further. Someone out there might still be folding napkins in silence, waiting to be remembered.